Thank you very much for having me here today. And so today I'll present to you my research on François-Jean de Chastellux, who was a French major general who fought in the American Revolution in the French army. And so he visited Trenton. So I'll tell you all about that and why he visited and what that means for the war and for the French campaign in general. So I'm checking if this works. Yes. So of course, we're really going to focus on Trenton today and the Battle of Trenton, with whom you must, or with which you should be, I'm sure, very familiar, but you might not know that the French were observing Trenton and the battlefield of Trenton as part of their overall strategy of the war. So I'll go back to their arrival in 1780, just to put some context for you so that you remember when the French came and why and everything. And then we'll go to the moment they were visiting Trenton. And also, they were here, of course, at the William Trent house, where they were encamped close by, and some of the French put some cannons apparently here in the garden. So maybe there's still some remains of that. I don't know. We should maybe dig after this to figure that out. But so I'll talk about all these different things. And so just to give you some context on the French in the American Revolution, I'm sure you're all familiar with this, but I still will give you some details to understand that, of course, in 1780, there was a second French expedition that arrived on the coast of Rhode Island in Newport. And so the King Louis XVI had sent what you call expeditionary army, so a small unit of 5,000 or more 6,000 soldiers that came to fight along with George Washington. Of course, George Washington was in real need of help. This is in 1778, going up till 1780. And so the French and Americans had an alliance. So the French king decided to send an army over in order to support George Washington in his cause, of course, for American independence, mainly because, of course, the French wanted to weaken the British. Another reason was that some of them believed in the cause of liberty, but it was mainly relating, of course, to their own power too, because if they would defeat the British and make sure that the British would lose the 13 colonies of America, the French could profit from that, because it would, of course, rebalance the power in the world at the time. Anyway, so Rochambeau, as you know, was, of course, the general of this expedition that arrived in 1780. And so I'm going to talk about that specific army he was with, and especially about one of his main generals, as you know. But so also to give you some extra, of course, background, we can see it here in National Park Service, the Revolutionary Road, that I'm sure you're familiar with if you live here. But if you're not, you should look around and see the different signs that are put, well, around the route that the French would walk from Newport, where they were based, down to Yorktown. So you can imagine this is a very large route. If you want to do it today, it will take a long time, as it did for them, of course. But you could do it driving, you could do it walking, or you could do it maybe on horseback, as some of them did too. But so it's a very interesting trail, because it really gives you, of course, sort of an impression of the distances that were marched. So they were walking with a lot of heavy, of course, material, but they were also, of course, doing this in order to go to Yorktown, where they would, of course, win together the Battle of Yorktown. So the French would march from Newport to Yorktown, and the Americans would come in around New York and join them too. So it was really a march that would go all together. And so in August 1781, just before their arrival in Yorktown, they stopped here in Trenton, where, of course, they were encamping. So the soldiers had to camp every day around this route in order to go down, because they had to sleep, of course, at one point. And so they were encamping around this route, and you can visit that still today. You can see where all these encampments were. Most are not that necessarily passionate to see, because it's just, for instance, a parking lot or something else today. I mean, the encampments are maybe not the most exciting, but of course the homes that were around that really are, I would say, just as here, the Trent house, which of course was not called William Trent house at the time, but they were visiting. And you can see, so, okay, what I want to say about this, the end of August 1781, the French came here, and was especially, so this is an image of how it used to look at the time, around the 1800s. This is, of course, a painting from, I would say, a Frenchman, Count de Maulevier, that shows that Trenton was inhabited by about 100, or there were around 100 homes here, and there were two main roads, King and Queen's Road, apparently they were called. And so when the French arrived here, one of the main sort of activities or their interest was to visit the Battle of Trenton site. This site was famous at the time already because it had been really a sort of a marking point, and I'll tell you later why, but it was a marking point, of course, in the course of the war. It was, of course, early on in the war, 1776. But for the French, this was an interesting point to observe because, of course, it had really changed the minds of Americans, mainly in their possibility to defeat the strong British army. And so some of the French officers would actually visit the Battle of Trenton site and would go there as sort of a pilgrimage already. You could say sort of a war tourism started at the time. And of course, they all knew about the famous, at the time already, crossing of the Delaware, of course, painting from later period, but we all know this painting too. And of course, the Battle of Trenton was intriguing to them specifically, of course, because the army they were fighting with had defeated the British there. So there were maybe some lessons to learn from it. And so these French officers in August 1781 visited, but someone else had already visited it a year before them. This was François-Jean de Chastellux. And you have never heard of him, probably. Maybe some have, because he has written a travel diary that you can see here that he published in 1786, and that has been translated at the time, but also later in the 1989, it has been retranslated. And so you can have that edition. You can get it quite easily still today. But so it's a very interesting travel diary describing the early American Republic, as he would call it himself. But he traveled in the period of his campaign from 1780 until 83 through America. And so, well, that's what he did, but he was specifically the major general of Rochambeau, so meaning that he was second in command, mainly in charge of the logistics of the French army. And specifically more, he was the what you call liaison officer between Rochambeau and Washington, because he spoke English very well, which was rare in the higher ranks of the French army, also in the lower ranks, by the way, but specifically for the generals, Rochambeau didn't speak English, for instance, and the people around them, called the Vieux-Menil brothers, didn't speak English either. So Chastellux was the highest ranking that spoke English very well himself. And so he became this figure that really was the liaison between, sort of the intermediary between the French and American armies in the 1780s. And so this is published, but for the rest, probably you've never heard of him, but as had been mentioned, I discovered his private papers in this chateau, so the castle of Chastellux, which is still today in the hands of the Chastellux family. And so they have decided to keep their archives private. And so part of these archives were the papers of Chastellux that they didn't really know they had themselves. They had heard of it, but they've never been into their tower, which you can, by the way, see a small part here, but it's this part. It's a huge tower that you can see, it's hidden. But anyway, that tower has the archives of the family. And so I discovered, together with the current owner, Philippe, that they had this huge collection of the person, Chastellux, François-Jean de Chastellux, of his entire life. So his papers contain letters of George Washington, but also Thomas Jefferson and Adams and Franklin, and almost all the founding fathers you've heard of have written to and with Chastellux. But then there's also a large collection of, for instance, Voltaire and Diderot and D'Alembert, so the French philosophers, as well as correspondences with, for instance, Jeremy Bentham and David Hume, so more from the Scottish and English philosophers. So you can already feel that there is this sort of interesting mix between the philosophers of the French Enlightenment and this American Revolutionary War he was both part of. And so you'll see that that sort of mind frame of him, we'll see it later on, because he was not just a military man, he was himself a philosopher who had, he wrote a lot of books himself that were part of the philosophy of the French Enlightenment, such as on happiness. On happiness and on, for instance, cures against the smallpox, and lots of different subjects, also going from music to theories on theater and so on. So he was one of these very sort of standard enlightened figures. But so when he came to America, as I already said, he was traveling, and he was not just traveling for his military duty also, but he was also just very interested in this realization of the new republic that he believed in, because he had thinking about this more in an abstract way, but when he was here, he could see the reality of it, which leads to many fascinating insights in the American history and also about many different sides of the American Revolution that I will not discuss, of course, today, because I'm focusing on Trenton here. But there's a lot to say about these the views that he had and the ideas he had on America and what he was specifically exchanging with those that were constructing it at the time. But today we're talking really about the military campaign. And so going back to the summer of 1780, so the French arrive in Newport, and so they're quite disappointed, unfortunately. They had imagined that in Newport there would be a huge crowd waiting for them with their American ally, and that Americans would be extremely happy and thankful that they finally came. Americans didn't care that much. They were actually quite hostile to them, as we can see on certain prints of the time. They thought that the French were effeminate, so that they were kind of feminine beings, not the men that they should have been to fight, but they were more portrayed as people wearing wigs and makeup and perfume. And that they were very arrogant, one of these things that might resonate still today, I don't know. And so there was another problem too, is that they were Catholic, and Catholics, of course, were considered serious enemies too, because most of the people inhabiting, of course, these lands were mainly, they left their lands in Europe because of their religious persecutions. So a Catholic coming back, what does that mean? Do they want to invade America and sort of impose Catholicism? Did they have sort of scary monks and the Pope that would come himself to come back here and to recolonize? So when they would have independence, Catholics might come. This was real fears that were not just sort of funny, but they were actual fears, especially based on the 7 Years' War, which of course had happened prior from 56 to 63, well, in Europe, but also in America, where of course the French had been the real enemies of the Americans. So these prejudices and negative ideas were mainly based because they had been fighting against them. Another thing that would have been weird for Americans that they ate you can already see it here on this slide, by the way, you can see little frogs grilling, but they were eating frogs and snails. So they were weird creatures and they were just scary to them. So then there's the other side of the stories. Of course, the French arrived and saw something quite disappointing because they had imagined quite a good American army, a strong American army. They had had reports from people like Franklin himself in Paris telling we have a very strong army. And then they arrived and the army was just quite small. And of course, they didn't have much food. They didn't have many clothes on. They didn't have uniforms. And they were just, according to some of the testimonies, they were naked. They didn't wear anything almost. And they were, as we know, there was a real problem of paying these troops. And so there was, of course, instead of seeing a magnificent army to fight with, they were afraid of them, leading to comments such as, we wanted to crush the English and we thought the occasion favorable before arriving, but we have contracted an alliance with rebel subjects. We have to feed, clothe, pay the Americans, and even fight for them. So this is Chastellux, the person I spoke about. When he just arrived in the summer of 1780, he wrote this to the French Minister of Foreign Affairs saying, what did we do? This is terrible. And he said, with the aid we send ourselves, so he was also, of course, thinking about the French aid, it's very mediocre and unlikely to give an advantageous opinion on our strength to our new ally. They had only sent 6,000 men. They had planned to send about 3,000 more. Unfortunately, ships were not ready and it just all went wrong. So the whole second division, what they would call, didn't arrive. And there was also a problem with the fleet that couldn't come on time either. So the French knew too that what we want to send, it didn't come yet, and this will not really work. But they were kind of ashamed of how small their army was when they arrived in Newport. So there were some ideas to leave. Chastellux himself had an idea to pretend he was sick so that he just could go back to France. But they all decided, let's stay and do something against this complicated situation. And I'm saying this kind of in a funny way because, okay, but of course, these people were really in despair. The French had arrived and they needed to fight. They had finally their occasion to fight the English, but what can we do? The Americans, of course, were also at the end of their struggle almost. As during multiple times, of course, in the war, but it was really a situation of despair. And so Chastellux proposed to Rochambeau and George Washington himself to do a study mission. And it's what you call a reconnaissance mission. It's kind of well-known military thing, but he really went quite far in this by suggesting he wanted to study not only the terrain, he wanted to study the people of America, he wanted to study their religion, he wanted to see where can we recruit new Continental Army officers. And so he said, we have to travel in the country, see the army and measure the disposition of the people. So they did this actually with a little group of people. In the winter of 1780 and 81, there was really a research mission of the French army combined with American officers too, in order to study the fields they had to fight in, the enemy they had to fight against, of course, but also their allies. And in order to understand their allies and to build trust instead of these crazy prejudices, not that crazy maybe, but at least the prejudices that were circulating, they needed to understand each other better. And so there was this whole sort of group that would be a foundation of a real group of trust within the top, the higher ranks in the French and American armies, which would become quite important because mistrust, of course, is what you have to fight in an alliance. And so they would do this. This would called what Chastellux himself would refer to as the Groupe de Recherche, a research group, where they would do what they would call the long tour of the continent from Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, Delaware, and Massachusetts, and a secret mission to Virginia as well. So you could see a lot of states were visited in order to really map the United States. Another thing they had to do is draw maps. There were no really good, accurate maps at the time. So they would send the French engineers. They were trained by the big French academies to draw very good maps. So you can see, for instance, this one is Chastellux's own map, but there were many maps produced at this time. And so the group was composed of Chastellux himself, another major general called de Vieux-Menil. Montesquieu was the aide-de-camp of Chastellux and grandson of the famous philosopher, of course. And then there were a few others that were accompanying them. They were all engineers, map makers, and people that could just observe. So they made a lot of lists, and this is quite unknown, but the Chastellux papers reveal this. Lots of lists and very, very, very long. It's literally hundreds of pages, big sort of reports that would really detail every single state, how many people live there, who are they, where are they from, and so on. So this gives us a very interesting, of course, sort of vision into the early American different states, but also what the French would think of them. They were working together with Knox, so Henry Knox, with Hamilton himself, Humphreys, Tillman, Moylan, Lafayette, and Washington. Lafayette, of course, is the famous French Lafayette, who I put in the American camp as he was fighting with the continent. He was in the Continental Army. But for the little anecdote, he was also related to Chastellux because Chastellux was his uncle by marriage. So they knew each other very well and worked together actually a lot. They did a lot of these trips together, and George Washington joined as well. So you can see that it was of importance, not just for Chastellux, but it was also of importance for George Washington because they needed to cooperate with this French army. And it really could go very wrong if there would be no trust or no purpose together. So this research mission is actually an important step for them. And of course, an important moment for Chastellux and those he was traveling with was to meet George Washington in person for the first time. And this happened here in New Jersey, actually, at the Day Mansion, which is open today, or at least maybe not every day, but it's open to the public. And it's just for the anecdote, Washington met him in November. So when he just started his mission, he went to see his headquarters, but it was mainly to already ask him, give me all the information you have that we need. So he needed information on battlefields, he needed information on population, on where do all your different soldiers come from, which states are prone to maybe come back to a loyalist side or not, all these different questions. And so they would spend quite a few days together in this day mansion. And it's also quite funny, here's a quote where he describes this of his travel diary, saying that a few glasses of claret and Madeira accelerated the acquaintances. So of course, they're all having fun as well. But Chastellux would say, I soon felt myself at ease near the greatest and the best of men. So this is also interesting because Chastellux really admired Washington for his military leadership specifically, as we'll see too later. And there would be a deep friendship. And this is one of these letters that I found in the Chastellux archive that is now on display, by the way, at Mount Vernon. But so Washington would write later to Chastellux about their deep and lasting friendship, a friendship which neither time nor distance can ever eradicate. I can truly say that never in my life did I part with a man to whom my soul clave more sincerely than it did to you. So sounds very romantic almost. Yeah, it was a real romance for sure. There were a lot of these kind of letters going back and forth. And it's a tone that's quite unusual for George Washington specifically to write this to. He would have these kind of language to other men, but this level is something else. But so the reason I'm pointing this out is also because what I said before, these prejudices, friendships were important in this military alliance. And sometimes we tend to overlook the individual roles of people within alliances and military in general, like the revolution. But these friendships were actually important, of course, for the outcome of the war where they had to fight together against the British. You need a bit more than just kind of hating the British, of course. You need to have something together. And so one of their main passions together was to study military theories of, well-known European military thinkers like Guibert, who was French, and Frederick the Great, of course, the Prussian king that had, been very important in the 7 Years' War. And so they were especially studying war together. So they were, of course, discussing many other subjects as well, but their main point was studying war, theorizing war, and understand how can we defeat these British finally. And for one of the things that Chastellux did for this, as I said, organized this reconnaissance mission in which he was in the midst of during this meeting with George Washington. So they met for, as I said, for about 4 days together, just they spoke. This is because you can reconstruct that through the letters, but they spent quite a lot of time together to study the war together. And Washington gave him all his papers, all his correspondences, the maps he had, all these things, so that Chastellux and the people he was with could really study this. And one of the most important things for Chastellux was to actually go to the battlefields. That's of course, of the battlefields from 75, 6, 7, 8, 9 until he came in 1780. So there were quite a lot of course, American battlefields that he wanted to understand. He wanted to understand, how do the Americans fight? How can we fight with them? They were not a conventional European army as the French were, nor the British, of course, were also one of these very well-trained, sort of unified army units. The American army was getting there, of course, during this period. They were reforming and becoming one of their more trained armies, but they also had some other tactics that the French didn't really know about. So they wanted to really understand these tactics, but also the new fields. Europe was way more sort of cultivated lands, agricultural lands. So it was a different, nature here. There were lots of forests still. There were almost no roads. It was very different than what the Europeans were used to, of course. So Chastellux would say that the best method for military men in following the campaigns of great generals on the ground is not to have the different positions pointed out and explained to them. It's better to visit the places, to look well about on every side, and to propose to themselves little problems on the nature of the ground and on the advantages to be derived from it. And so then he would compare ideas with facts, so ideas that he had heard with the actual facts on the ground, by which means they will be able to rectify the former and appreciate the latter. Well, so this is a whole research method, and that's why I kind of entitled this whole presentation the first historian of the Battle of Trenton, because this is really what he did. He did this for all the battle he would visit, and in general for everything he did. He never just took anything for granted. He would always go for research. He would read different accounts from different sides. He would look at different maps and so on. So as a real sort of historian, he worked, but also as, of course, a very enlightened figure that would always have to think for yourself. So this is what you can refer to as sort of this military way of thinking, enlightened way of thinking about war, which is the topic of the book I'm writing now, but okay. And so Chastellux visited, as you can see, Trenton, but he also visited this other list of other places in which, as I already said, he would read the accounts of George Washington that he had copies. So in the papers that I found, there are lots of copies of George Washington's personal accounts of everything. The letters he wrote, their copies written by one of the secretaries of Chastellux. He would also have lots of other letters, gazettes, so these newspapers and so on, to study them. And as I already said, he went to the grounds with those that participated in them. So let's focus on Trenton, of course. He went to Trenton, as we can see here. So he left from George Washington's place in the Day Mansion and said, George Washington himself was so good to point out my journey and send someone before me to prepare the lodgings and to give me Colonel Moylan to conduct me as far as Trenton. So Colonel, that's very complicated for me to say every time, but the Colonel Moylan, he had participated in the Battle of Trenton. So he would show him personally this place. And so Chastellux is always very happy to mention that he has breakfast with George Washington. So I just put it there too, but it's quite funny that he always mentioned these things. And so this is another quote about Trenton, which I think is quite telling for how exciting it was for him to go here, because he says the next day's ride presented us with very interesting objects. So you have to imagine he's on his horse going to Trenton, being excited, thinking we're going to see places which will be forever dear to Americans, since it was their first rays of hope brightened upon them, or to express it more properly, that the safety of the country was affected. These celebrated places are Princeton and Trenton. Of course, Princeton and Trenton is quite combined often, but I really will focus only on Trenton now. And so he also says, I confess that I was rather anxious to examine the traces of George Washington in a country where every object reminded me of his successes. So again, admiration doesn't stop ever. It will go on and on. One of the main reasons for that, by the way, it's because he actually admired him, but it's also because Washington represented a real ideal for Chastellux that was not an aristocrat like himself, by the way, but most generals in France, of course, all of them were always from very high aristocracy, and most of them had inherited their positions and were not that talented at the time necessarily. So here he could see someone that was not from aristocracy, that was for him, this is of course not for everybody today, but he was just a farmer. And so for him, it was very impressive that a farmer could actually be a general. And for him, it became a real sort of symbol for what in France should also become the norm, that sort of the normal people with their talents could become a general instead of their background. Okay, that's just a little side note, but studying and visiting Trenton is of course what Chastellux did. So as I said, he was really working as sort of a historian or a real scientist to study the war. And so the primary sources of Chastellux were quite diverse, as we'll see. So as I already said, the Moylan went with him and he showed him where 180 English, he called them English, interesting, because as we know, the Battle of Trenton were mainly these Hessians, but of course they were part of the British army, so he called them the English. So he apparently pointed out where they had laid their arms, what happened, where, and so on. So he was really explaining these things to him. Again, just show how beautiful it was. And so he would also read the gazettes of the time. Apparently, he had found the gazettes per state, and of course, in North America, there were a lot of these gazettes circulating, but also in England, even in France, they were all reporting on the Battle of Trenton. And so he would say, of course, that every person has read about Trenton through the gazettes, where the General Washington surprised the town of Trenton on the 25th of December, 1776. So he also used maps that are quite known today, that you can see actually in his private papers that he was sort of sketching them. So I'm not sure if he saw exactly this one, but probably, because in his own papers, you can see that he kind of drew little things to understand this. So here are the maps that are now at the Library of Congress. This is a British map, because he's always saying, I'm using different maps in order to really see and understand what happened. And he spoke to Henry Knox, who was, of course, part of this, Tench, Tillman, also participant, and Moylan, as I already mentioned. So they all explained to him their version of the Battle of Trenton. Then you would read, because there are copies of these letters specifically in his papers, which is quite surprising sometimes to find lots of copies of all the letters that Lafayette received. He did this also for, Washington. He also did it for Lafayette's letters. But so he would just, he had this letter, for instance, that Washington had written to McDougall about the entire Trenton campaign. So we will dive into the details of the Trenton campaign a little bit now, but it's really based on these letters because that's what Chastellux would write about later too. So of course, Washington explains, I crossed over the Jersey the evening of the 25th, about 9 miles above Trenton, with upwards of 2,000 men, and we attacked 3 regiments of Hessians, consisting of 1,500 men, about 8 o'clock next morning. So, okay, we won't have to go through the whole, of course, quotes, but this is just one of these with the numbers. There were apparently, they were, of course, surrendering, and then they had 886 privates to lay down their arm. These numbers will fluctuate a little bit in the different accounts, so it's always interesting to see, of course. And they had between 20 and 30 killed at the Trenton attack. Then there's, of course, a famous letter from Washington to Congress that also is in copy at the Chastellux papers. And so here's the full account, of course, where Washington is explaining that on the evening on the 25th, the troops were going with 3 different divisions to cross the Delaware. Only one made it because it was so cold and so terrible and so icy. And so, of course, around 4, they arrived instead of at 12 as planned before. And so then he explains the 2 divisions that he would march down or up, I'm not sure about that, the road. And so, of course, he's just describing how the different units arrived in the town and, of course, how they surprised their enemy. So just to remind us, there were, of course, these Hessian soldiers were part of the British army, and they were based here in Trenton at the time. So it apparently was a good attack for them, a good point of attack, because of course the British were spread around here, around in New Jersey, as the Continental Army was. But Washington had identified this precise point of Trenton as being the good point of attack, because the Hessians could not necessarily escape easily if they would attack through or by the river. And so, of course, Washington is describing all this, and I'm reading this because Chastellux was reading it too. But so he just explains how the main body of the Hessians was formed, but they were undetermined how to act. It was just panic. They were, of course, this was in the morning. They just, well, some accounts would say, or sort of this legend, that they were very drunk and couldn't act because it was Christmas. There's not really proof for that specific interpretation, but of course they were surprised. So there might have been sort of somewhere on post and guarding, but they were, of course, surprised by this huge, well, almost more than 2,000 men attacking them was, of course, quite the surprise. And so they were struck by panic, we could say. And so here you could see how that all went, of course. So from that they were trying to do something, but then Washington threw a body of troops in their way, which immediately checked them. And then they were surrounded, and they must inevitably, they would be cut to pieces, he would say. So they actually agreed to lay down their arms. And so here again, you can see these number of men, how many were killed. And so he said, I don't exactly know, but about 20 or 30, but around these 900 men, of course, were taken capture. And then he says also, our loss is very trifling indeed. Only 2 officers and 1 of the privateers are wounded. All right, so all these different accounts. So Chastellux, to study Trenton, as I said, went here. He studied it with these 3 officers. He read the Gazette articles, looked at the maps, looked at Washington's own correspondences, and then he wrote about it in his own travel diary. So here's just a travel diary, but also in his personal notes that you can find in the private papers. There's a lot of just little writings and sort of notes, and it's all extremely hard to decipher because his handwriting is already terrible, but then his own notes are very hard to understand, and he's also always drawing things next to it, so it's complicated. But what is interesting is, so he writes about it, and I just selected a few parts, but what I thought was quite surprising to read was that he's talking about Trenton. So first of all, he had remarked nothing interesting on the road there, unless the beauty of the country, which everywhere corresponds with the reputations of the Jersey, called the Garden of America. So still today. And I'm not sure where it exactly comes from. Maybe someone knows this Garden of America, but I just Googled it in the car, and it looks like it's more like in the end of the 18th century or more 19th century term. But apparently during the Revolution, it was already considered the garden. Anyway, so he was then just explaining the road descends a little and permits one to see at the east end of the town, the orchard where the Hessians hastily collected and surrendered. So he visited that place, of course, too. Then, of course, he was describing, we know that General Washington at the head of only of 3,000 men passed the Delaware in dreadful weather on the night of the 24th and 26th, that he divided his troops into two columns, one of which made a circuit to gain a road upon the left, leading to the Maidenhead Road, and then describing how they all marched towards Trenton. And then, of course, he's describing how it all went, so I will not go through that again, but so he's describing how the different parts were attacking. And so what I think is especially interesting is that Chastellux would really consider this a very important battle. He said, of course, the spirit in a successful enterprise with its consequences merits certainly a conspicuous place in the history of this great revolution. The surprise at Trenton changed the whole face of affairs and restored energy to the friends of America in that important seat of war. Of course, he's talking about 1776, where almost everything went wrong for the Continental Army. Besides now here, there was newfound hope. They could actually fight the British, maybe in a more unconventional manner because it was just a surprise attack, but it did work. So they could fight these very well-trained troops with what could be considered the ragtag army, as it's always described, of course. And so then he also says that Pennsylvania was now in safety. The Jerseys were evacuated. The English reduced to the towns of Brunswick and Amboy, where they were obliged to act always on the defensive. So now they were kind of really pushed back. So this was an important action. He's talking about, of course, Trenton, but also Princeton here. But it's this combination of both where they both won that really made this difference. And I think this is especially, you can see this more enlightened view again about war, where he says that we see that the great events of war are not always the great battles. Humanity may receive some consolation from this reflection, that the art of war is not necessarily a sanguinary art. It's not necessarily about bloodshed, that the talents of the commander spare the lives of the soldiers. So the affair of Trenton, whence this originated, cost no dear and was glorious. There was, of course, bloodshed, but it's limited to what Chastellux was kind of used to, of course, in the French wars that he had been fighting in as well. And then Trenton's importance, he goes even further. He says, so this is in a complete different part of the book when he's just reflecting on nation building of America and how they would need good national stories, let's say, to make this very diverse and the different states, how should they be united? It's for him, you need things such as heroes that they should be put into marble and by artists should represent the important battles, for instance. And then he wants statues. Well, this is, of course, something we could discuss after this talk, but he wants statues of Washington with these inscriptions, and then also of Hancock, Adams, and Franklin. And then he wants especially to have the battles of Bunker Hill, Saratoga, Trenton, Princeton, Monmouth, and Cowpens represented in huge monuments. And he wants this to, of course, commemorate the battle, but also to really form this nation based on their glorious victories that they had all together. So while this, of course, happened, I'm sure you know this battle monument. And so to go to the, so as I said, Trenton was one of their study objects. There are many other battles that they have studied. They also studied many other parts of American history. And I just want to mention this specifically because in the presentation before, talking about Native Americans and African Americans on the grounds, of course, here in Trenton, but also in general New Jersey and the 13 states. One of the preoccupations of the French was also to understand these stories and to understand the different groups living here in America. So they were literally just looking at where does everybody come from. And slavery was, of course, one of the main themes that are coming back in their thinking. Some are pro-slavery, some are anti-slavery, some are very fierce abolitionists, but it's, of course, it's a very diverse group. There are lots of different ideas, but they also report on, for instance, the number of Black soldiers in the Continental Army. They describe Native Americans when they go to different places and where they meet with Native Americans. They describe women during the war and so on. So it's this study led to much more than this military story that I just told. It led to this sort of more demographic, ethnographic study that they did, which can teach us a lot of different aspects of the American Revolution today as well. So the conclusions of the reconnaissance expedition itself was that the sort of this nascent United States, as they would call it, represented hope. Instead of that complete despair that had feared or felt in Newport, where they had actually the only option was just to leave again. They had realized that there was a real military potential. The Continental Army could fight. They had also visited places such as West Point, so the military fortifications were worthy of what they would consider their own European fortifications. They could fight different types of battles. I had understood that by, for instance, looking at Trenton. And the population was also much more actually prone to fighting for their independence that they had observed in Newport only. And so there was real hope. They found that at the end of this reconnaissance expedition. And one of the other important, of course, conclusions was that they would not attack New York, because they had find already during this winter that New York would have been very, very hard to attack, so that they would go further down to Yorktown. There are lots of other elements that I would not necessarily explain right now too much, but one of the main sort of advices that they would give after this reconnaissance expedition, and let's go to the south, that's where we're needed and that's where we can have success. So this whole reconnaissance expedition, as I already said, led to those studies of battlefields in order to understand the war they were in, but led to a lot of other parts of American history as well. And of course, I have to end with sort of a joke again, but it's about the French, because of course, all this had been said, there was hope, there was military potential, but they were doomed to destruction. The alliance with France could alone affect their salvation. So they really did need the French for this. All right. So thank you very much.
One question has nothing to do with Trenton, but there was an illuminating moment early in your presentation about the bromance between Chastellux and Washington.
Yes.
And people don't look at Washington that way. I thought if you would be kind enough to share another example of how they don't look at Washington, which was a humorous way involving Chastellux.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yes. So yes, because
people just don't see Washington that way.
Exactly. Washington, of course, is seen as a more austere military leader who was not necessarily funny, very stubborn, and was always serious. But it's true that in the testimonies of Chastellux, and especially in the Chastellux himself writes about this, but there's one letter that Washington writes to him, and I'm sure that's the one you're referring to, in 1787. So thing about Chastellux, he was never married throughout his life, but at the end of his life, he falls in love sort of dramatically. He falls in love really, and you can see that in the letters he writes to this woman, and then they get married. And so Washington writes to him in a very funny way about this wife, and he makes fun about it. You found a wife, you're finally caught by domestic felicity.
By the contagion.
That's it, by the contagion. Yes, by the contagion of domestic felicity, and just makes jokes about marriage in that letter. And that's very rare for George Washington to go sort of out of his comfort zone there, and making jokes about marriage. And there are a few examples of this where you can see that they really had a good time together. And so, yeah, that's one of the signs of George Washington. Other sides that are also very lesser known, at least, about George Washington is for his philosophical side, thinking about, for instance, he wants to create universal peace. That's another thing you can see in the letters. So universal peace created not by the conflict between nations based on their expansion of the territory, but by commerce, by commercial ties and by trade. He's believing, well, maybe a little naive there, but he's believing in the sort of new possibilities of trade, creating sort of a balance instead of fighting well. And so, but there's also his interest in theater, his interest in music, his interest in medicine, and especially, of course, agriculture. So they write about all these different topics that tend to be forgotten if you think about Washington as the general and the president. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to go online to Robert. He has two questions for you. The first one, did Chastellux learn anything, corrections about past battles that was implemented during future battles in the rest of the war?
Very interesting question.
Okay, and is there any record that Chastellux might have had access to any British or Hessian accounts about the battles that he studied?
So I'll start with the second question. So about the the Hessian or British sources he might have had. Yes, he had British sources specifically, because you can see that in his material. He also had, like, his library has been maintained mainly, so you can see everything he probably has read, because of course it's in his library. So the British accounts, Hessian accounts, there was a map, I think, of a Hessian that he had also looked at least. So yes, there were both sides, and he was actually, he spoke German and read German as well. So yes, probably he has also had that access. And then did he apply, or at least learn from the past battles in order to fight the ones that were to come, and specifically obviously Yorktown there. I think, yes, I should study that more to really understand the exact tactic of Yorktowns and which ones were inspiring. But what I do know is that Chastellux, in his thinking, and I'm talking now about Chastellux, but of course I'm talking also about the military staff he was working with, they could see, for instance, this idea of skirmishing and more like this, what we would maybe call guerrilla, I'd never know that, but tactics that would be, they would fight, of course, which was not in the conventional way of the French armies that were more trained in sort of this basic formations and columns and everything. Of course, Yorktown became a classic siege warfare, so I'm not sure where we could really place that, but what I do know is the French army came back and they started to theorize what they had seen in America, and then Napoleon takes it. That's where you can see a clear influence of American Revolutionary warfare up until Napoleon, brought back by the French officers. And that would be a thing to study more, to really understand, but you can really at least feel the links when you start studying that. So.
Another in-person question.
You mentioned that the family wanted to keep the archives part, so I was wondering, how did you want getting access to the papers?
Yeah. That's I always like that question because it's a fun story to tell. But so the reason they want to, just before starting the story, but the reason they keep it private today, so in France, as here in the US, there's of course national archives, but the family has decided to keep, so in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, the National Archives started to, well, gather lots of archives in France to make them nationally available. This started at the French Revolution, but mainly became important in the 19th century. But one of the main archives burns down during the Paris Commune, well, in 1870. And so the Chastellux family was like, no, we are not putting in them any of these national places. We're keeping it in our own castle. So that's the story there. And up until today, it's in their, in the, how do you call that? If you inherit the sort of contracts there, the testaments, that's the word. It's still in there really explicitly. We keep the archive. So, but the reason I kind of came across them is because, so I'm Dutch, but my parents bought a home in Burgundy when I was young. And in the garden, there's a tree called the tulip poplar tree. So this is a very common tree around here, and it's very big. I think Brad has one in the garden, right? Yes. So it's this huge tree. It's standing in our garden, as I said. But so this tree is, according to the legend, local legend, planted by Lafayette. But so just after the Revolutionary War, he brought back a few trees. This is, by the way, true, but it's not true that he planted it in our garden, because it was actually Chastellux who did that. Oh. And I found that by looking in archives, local archives in a city called Dijon. And so without knowing anything about, I'll just go back to the castle slide because it's always fun to see, of course. So since I had no idea who Chastellux was, but I knew that there was a village called Chastellux close by. Here we go. There's it. So I knew about this village called Chastellux, and so I found out that you could visit the castle. And so I just went, and I met the owner called Philippe de Chastellux, who at the time did the tours himself. And so I said, I was about 18. I'm like, hey, we have this tree, and he said, oh, we have the same tree. This is literally how it just went. He showed me that nice tree. And then I was like, so who was Chastellux? Why is he in America? What happened? And then he gave me that travel diary that I have mentioned as well. And when I read that, I got very intrigued because he's describing all his meetings with Washington, but also with Jefferson, with Franklin in Paris before, but also with Thomas Paine and all these people that we've all heard of. And the way he's describing America is kind of like Tocqueville, his descriptions of the democracies of America, but he's making all these comparisons between state constitutions. And I just got very intrigued. And so few years later, when I was studying history at the time, I just decided to start a project on Chastellux. And that led me to realize that there's not much source material on him in French archives or others, but that there is, of course, there's a lot of traces of him. So you can always, for instance, Washington's papers will have the letters, and Jefferson too. And so I'm like, what happened? So I went back to Philippe to ask, do you know if you have material on him? Because there's a lack of sources. Lots of historians know him, as in they quote him, but no one knows who he really was. So I went back, and then Philippe told me about their archive tower. And he said, the thing is, it starts in 1328 up until today, and it's just too big. And I kind of hate that place because it's so much to see. So we still went, and there's this huge box saying François-Jean on it. So it was easy to find, luckily. And it was also actually classified. So it was all very easy. And so we got it out and just opened the boxes. And the letters of George Washington, one of the first ones we saw. And then the Jefferson letters, Franklin letters, Adams letters, all that. And it just didn't stop. And then lots of maps of the American Revolution came out too. And at the further boxes was, of course, these French philosophers I mentioned, his own papers, specifically his private correspondence with almost everybody I just mentioned, but also his the manuscript of the books that he published. It's just this sort of this archival treasure that was just stayed in private hands. And so that's why I wrote my PhD on this, because I couldn't stop when I was in there. I still can't stop because I'm still working on it. So
awesome. So it's interesting. Patrick also had questions about the plan, and I think you answered this. Are there plans to publish some of the private papers, especially the pages of details on each state? So you said the family is not interested because
they're getting there. It's a slow process. Andre knows it all because it's a very frustrating process here, where the family, they're very suspicious of the whole thing of making it public. But now my book is published, so a lot of the archives or the transcriptions are out. And now together with Mount Vernon, we're actually working on this digitization, and it's probably going to happen very soon. It's a long process. So probably, I'm saying probably here to make sure it's not an official announcement, but yeah, probably that's happening soon. And then there's also the project of making this documentary film on it. So they're opening up. Really, yeah.
someone else needs that. Anyone else? This right here.
Yeah.
Right here.
Hi.
I just wanted to I'm coordination.
Yeah.
And the first time I ever heard of the importance of the Battle of Trenton was in one of the classes I had. So it's very refreshing to hear the importance of that he had in bringing that particular fact out. Because in the book, I remember that I had in college, it talked about if it were not for the Battle of Trenton, we would not be a nation. And I remember that quote specifically, and I tell that to my students.
Mm-hmm. Well, you can use the quote now of Chastellux as well, maybe about this hope and but it is, yeah, it's one of these, because they were really breaking. It was almost a point where they kind of had just to surrender and give up. But then Washington apparently thought maybe this is the last sort of push we can do, and it worked. So there is a newfound hope that they needed a few times more as well. Saratoga is one of the other ones that there was really this turning point of we can actually win if all the conditions are there, but we can. So there, yeah, Trenton and Princeton, of course, are, yeah, crucial.
So we have another question by Robert. Would you have your hand up?
Could you speak to Chastellux's previous military career and the experience and attributes which made him a good choice to be second in command?
Yes. So, well, as a lot of the Frenchmen of his time in French aristocracy, he started when he was 12, so quite young. But so he was mainly educated in what you call the art of war, as they would say themselves, by his brothers. So he had 4 brothers who were all serving in the same regiment, the Auvergne regiment. So they were from Burgundy, but they were serving in the Auvergne regiment, one of the most prestigious regiments of its time, apparently. But so his father was also part of it. So he was really trained in his own family. And then at the total end of the Austrian War of Succession, he started to actually be active in war, but then his main military career was really during the 7 Years' War in Germany. So he wasn't serving in America at the time. He was based in Germany, in different Germanic states, as they would be called, of course, at the time. But so he really rose quite quickly from, so he had his own regiment during the 7 Years' War. So it was called the Régiment de Chastellux, but whatever, but it became the Chastellux regiment actually at the time. And he lost a lot, of course, as the French did during the 7 Years' War. But he learned a lot from the different wars in the 7 Years' War, especially on, he was thinking mainly on how to reform the French army, because the French army lost so dramatically, of course, during the war, at 7 Years' War, especially in Germany. They lost many of their battles. And so that made him realize we have to change this army. We have to make it more merit-based. We have to make it more efficient by creating new types of column formations and so on. So he was really starting to become a theorist of war, mainly because of his losses. It really prompted him to sort of panic and think, if we don't change now, we are going to lose again. And so you can see that development of his thinking throughout the war already. But his main, I would say, one of the moments for him in the 7 Years' War, there's this battle of Rosbach, which is very well known, at least if you know 7 Years' War. But it's this battle where he's describing he's in complete panic. He doesn't understand. There's smoke everywhere. He's going to the enemy side thinking he's with his actual men. And so it's just panic, panic, panic. And so that's the moment he realizes we have to change warfare. This is not possible if we continue this way. So his experiences are really based on, I would say, the negative experience. But then another big important experience for him is that he goes to England, for instance, in 1768 to observe their fortifications and coastlines and everything. So he learns from the British on how to attack them. And that becomes him to think in this whole thing of reconnaissance missions. We have to study what we're going to do. He does that before America already. And then he goes to many other places to do the same. And so, for instance, Rochambeau and him, they're fighting during the 7 Years' War, they're together. So they're part of the group with this Auvergne regiment. Actually, Chastellux is the colonel. See, there's a problem there. I would say colonel. So here we go. But and so Rochambeau takes that regiment over. So they work a lot together, actually. So they know each other from that period. And then in this whole thing of what I said about reformation of the French army, Chastellux is working on these plans to advise some ministers of war and navy to reform, and Rochambeau does that too. So they're close together. And then there's one famous camp where they're together called the Vaussieux camp. Just before they leave to America, they're going to train the troops, and that's where Rochambeau is together with Chastellux as well. So it's a logical choice in the way that they fought together and sort of reformed the army together, and they're going to practice what they've theorized now together. So
awesome. I do have it online. So first of all, were you done? So,
there's another question, but
we're gonna come back. We're gonna come back to you. We're gonna flip-flop between the online and in person. And so yes, colonel, like a colonel can.
It's so hard to say. I don't know why.
Cool. I don't know why we.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's a great reason why.
Yeah. Colonel, yeah. But I have a problem with because there are two O's. Colonel, yeah.
When you look at the word.
Yeah. I'll forget though.
That you mentioned that there was another research group after Chastellux. Did they come to the same conclusions as Chastellux?
Yes. So I said that, of course, the French officers that were passing Trenton on their way to Yorktown also observed the Battle of Trenton, and it is all the same. It's not contradicting accounts or anything, but they all agree that it was a pivotal moment of war, and that's why they need to study it. So yeah. And then there was a question.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out, how does Chastellux square the fact that he was so idealistic about supporting revolution here, right, against the monarchy, when he himself and all his officers were serving a monarch back in France? I mean, I understand just, France was competing against England, so they saw supporting the patriots here. Yeah. It's just another way to harm England. But how did they square the whole versions of monarchy versus?
Yeah, that's always one of these sort of complicated questions, because also even for a king, why would Louis XVI send his army to fight against that? So that is quite complex, because most of the officers that you can study, and especially also Rochambeau, they're just doing their duty and they don't think that much about the cause. They're just fighting a war. That's it. But Chastellux himself and a few others, such as Lafayette too, they're really intrigued by, okay, there's this new sort of form of government possible. There's something as an alternative to a monarchy possible. And Chastellux personally really changed. So he's, of course, from one of the older aristocratic families of the Ancien Regime in France. He has all these noble privileges and he's completely part of that group. But at the same time, while being here, he starts to realize it can be different. We don't need all these privileges. We should maybe reform all that. So at the end of his life in 1787, he's starting to write a book about how to reform France based on the American model. So he is for reforming the monarchy to make it more sort of a mixed, what he would call the mixed constitution, which is a mix, but yeah, exactly, constitutional monarchy. So where you have the will of the people next to a monarch, actually. So he really gets inspired to change. So it's a very interesting question because that's exactly what happens. When he's here, he just realizes an absolute monarchy should not be the only form that we can do. If we apply a few principles that he had learned here in America, we can change. So it helped. A few is really rare, by the way. You don't read it much, but some of them really did change there. And then French Revolution breaks out 1789. So of course, many other reasons that are completely unrelated to this, but some are thinking of reforming France, and Lafayette is an important figure that is part of this reformist movement in France at the time. The king himself, by the way, also was quite interested in it, but then just everything went wrong.
I know what happened.
Everything went wrong. Yeah.
Pat just wanted to add some more to what was asked just now.
Appreciate the question, and I've thought about this in the past, but to me, the most simplistic answer is the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Yeah.
And that it was to the French's advantage to side with the Americans because the French were against the British. And it was only 20 years earlier, so to speak, when the Americans were fighting the French. And the most famous battle that I'm aware of where Washington lost was when he was in the British Army and had a fight at Fort Necessity in Pennsylvania and lost to the French.
So that is true. And it was also interesting about that is after the revolution, everyone think, oh, they're best friends now. They fought together, Yorktown, but no, it goes, we could say, wrong quickly again, because the relations, of course, sort of deteriorate very rapidly, especially after independence is gained in 1783. The Americans turned quickly back to the British for their trade. And so there's lots of new trade agreements, and the French feel quite betrayed by that. And so that actually even leads to what's called the semi-war during the French Revolution, where there's long stories with privateers and sort of pirates and lots of ships, and their trade is so there's a new fight kind of erupting there between France and America, because the French really hoped to achieve, of course, in American independence weaken the British, but also to kind of take their trade and to have free trade between America and France. And that failed. And then the relations turned quite bitter. And the big loans that were given by France to America could not be repaid. So there were lots of big issues there as well. So you could say the moment they needed to be together, to fight together, they were. And you can see that over history too. Of course, there's other wars coming up later on where the French and Americans are allies again. But as soon as that sort of, common ground is gone, they fade away again. So it's interesting, about that.
So I'm going to go online. First of all, a couple of wonderful comments from Glorianne. Thank you. A fascinating interpretation of the American-French alliance. And Robert said a very enlightening presentation. So thank you. Now, Lucy, I believe I'm saying her name correctly, put one more question that may make more sense to you than it does to me. I'm definitely going to pronounce it. Bourbonnais. Bourbonnais?
Oh, the Bourbon. Yeah, that's a regiment, a French regiment.
Okay. Yeah. Maybe just responding to something that was stated here. So if you don't have any reply to that.
It was just the word Bourbonnais.
Yeah, with a question. Lucy, I don't know if you wanted to say more about that, or were you adding to the conversation.
Because it was one of the French regiments, so
She might have just been responding to something that was happening.
yeah, or like during the lecture, I might have said a wrong regiment, or I don't know. I don't
Sure
know.
you did not.
I do want to say that the reenactors who
Oh, yeah.
reenact here, the Bourbonnais Regiment, are coming again. They came last year and camped on the grounds, and they will come again in end of August, so you can come and meet them, and maybe they know some of the story.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe that's what she was referring
that's
to on
probably
those that were camping.
right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so then the actual question I have from Sarah is, one slide showed various American figures and French names, including Dumas. Any relation, or
Yes.
is it Alexander Dumas?
Oh yeah, so that's this one, the research group,
Yes.
Dumas. So no, it's unfortunately completely unrelated to Dumas, the author. But Dumas, here is Mathieu Dumas, who was at the time aide de camp of Rochambeau, and he became a very important general under Napoleon. So he's one of his military figures that was serving in the American Revolution, comes back and applies ideas and so on. It's one of these. But Dumas, so there's of course Alexandre Dumas, the author, but I have looked at it, but they're not related. So no.
Thank you. Was there anyone?
Here's a question back.
Just as a, is there correspondence between the French minister Lucerne and Chastellux, particularly in Philadelphia in 1781? Because I'm actually working on Francis Hopkinson Temple of Minerva for American Independence.
So we definitely have to talk much more because I'm working on it too.
Yeah. Working in this material some time, and I'm fascinated, given the reference to music in Washington.
Yes.
And music in Monsieur the Comte de Saint, to know whether or not the relationship with the minister, the French minister, is in Monsieur de Chastellux, the Comte de Chastellux.
Yeah, so there is a large correspondence that unpublished that's between them in the papers that I've been working on a lot. I've transcribed them, so we can talk about them for sure. But so La Luzerne is the French, what you would call ambassador today, but he's the ambassador, the French ambassador. So he was the second ambassador sent to the United States at the time, living in Philadelphia. They already knew each other too from the 7 Years' War. So they had been, so La Luzerne is quite forgotten most of the time, but he was himself an officer of the French army in the 7 Years' War. They fought in Germany together and they stayed quite friendly. And another very interesting point in common, so now we're really going into details, but so Chastellux's grandfather was D'Aguesseau, was the Chancelier de France, so chancellor who was in charge of the finances of Louis XV. And then his successor is the grandfather of La Luzerne. And so there's lots of links between them because they were in exact same circles. And so when they were in America, they're both, they knew each other, of course, already from the French salons and these things. But then in Philadelphia, Chastellux visits him for about 2 weeks. So they're together for 2 weeks in Philadelphia, and La Luzerne introduces him to almost everybody you can imagine, but also to the American Philosophical Society of both, they're both member. And then what I think is extremely interesting too is that La Luzerne, of course, is as an ambassador very close to the US Congress. And so one of his main roles, I would say, is to really try to help at least consolidate these 13 states that are in constant competition about whatever you can imagine. And he's like, you should be together because we're in a war. You need a unified United States in order to fight a war and to raise taxes specifically. So he has this interesting role of really pushing for more unity there where there's a lot of disunity. And then with Chastellux, they're really discussing military details in great depth. They're talking about specifically the Yorktown campaign. You can learn a lot about La Luzerne was way more important than you can imagine in decision making, actually. So I would love to hear more about your research there about La Luzerne. But
Fantastic. Okay, we're gonna go back online.
There's another.
We gotta go back. We've been on a private conversation.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, after.
So we're trying to pass it around. So Glorianne, to your point of meeting other people, wanted to know, did Franklin meet Chastellux? And the question, I will tell you, Glorianne, about the recording later.
So yes, Franklin did meet Chastellux, so that was in Paris. So when Franklin, I mean, arrived in Paris, they were, of course, part of the same circles because Franklin immediately got drawn into the Salon of France, and so the Parisian salons, where, of course, the intellectuals and aristocrats and everyone would gather to have discussions. Franklin was received there as one of the most important inventors, of course, of the lightning and all these, like as a scientist. So Voltaire and Franklin met, for instance, and Chastellux was there during these meetings, and they write to each other afterwards as well. There's a very interesting letter that Franklin writes to Chastellux after Yorktown, and he said, "So I congratulate you with the success because you fought with your pen and your sword for the cause of public happiness," which is the book of Chastellux, of course. So he fought in the war, but also with his ideas. So it's one of the quotes I use a lot because my book is discussing these two sides. So yeah, so Franklin and him. And then there's another more about talking about funny letters with them. Franklin and Chastellux were in love with the same woman at one point. So this is Madame de Gléon with the G. And so Franklin says, "Well, it seems like I have competition with you, with Madame G. And so I'll leave it to you because she just really likes you better." Something like that. Is that so? Yeah.
There were. You sure? Any more? We do, because everybody's so excited. So Sarah would like to know, what is the name of Chastellux' travel account called? Can I find it in the library?
Yes, yeah, I'm sure you can, or maybe I don't know which library, but you could find it online quite easily. It's also on Google Books. It's totally scanned, so it's easy to find. It's just the Chastellux travels in North America in the years 1780, 81, and 82.
Super easy.
Yeah. No, we just type in Google book Chastellux travels and you'll find it.
You'll find it.
Yeah.
So I hope you
and if you know how to write Chastellux, because that's another question. But
we're gonna have a presentation.
Yeah.
So she can go back to the presentation online, get Chastellux, spelling of the name, and type in Chastellux travel account.
Yeah.
And it should come up. Thank you very much.
And what I think especially is with the Google search, because it's very long. So if you want to look at something specific, it's very easy to find it online. It's better, I would say. Yeah, because it's very long. And a lot of parts are not the most maybe exciting to most people. So yeah.
So I have one more question here, but
mine's like a hybrid question. You think about like the contributions like Chastellux to the revolution. And the French army, etc., and the French Navy. What do you make of the way many Americans nowadays tend to make jokes about the French military? Oh, they're all surrendering, they're all this, whatever. And we seem to forget that if it wasn't for like the French fleet keeping the British from being resupplied at Yorktown, etc., we could have possibly lost the Revolutionary War, or French soldiers fight side by side with our soldiers, well, particularly Yorktown and other areas. So it's a comment, but the question part is, just what do you make of that? The fact that many Americans, and I think and they're not getting political with it, but Americans, as they get more conservative, tend to forget about the French's essential contribution to our independence.
Yeah.
So just wondering what you make of that.
I would say it's you can already feel it in the early 19th century, and especially the whole 19th century. If you read history books discussing the American Revolution, and one of the most, like some of these sort of books that everyone was reading, the French roles diminished in them, because of course there was it's a period of the westward expansion, of the construction of this huge new continent, let's say, or the whole United States as we know it today. And for the national story, it was not the best story to tell, that actually without the French, or by the way, Spanish or even Dutch help, it would have been maybe different. So it was one of these roles that they were like, let's maybe just diminish them. Lafayette was, of course, there, Rochambeau a little bit too, but we fought for our independence. And that's really the story that you can read. And also that explains why the French role has been sort of left out of the history. And then up until today, that's just been taken over. So
that's potential misinformation.
It is, yeah, it's misinformation. It's also you need a national narrative as a nation at one point. And that's one of the reasons a lot of things have been left out, as we know. Right. Lots and lots of things.
Yeah. We got two hands. And here we go with another French. Jean-François de Saint-Lambert.
Yes, actually, I have to look that up because I'm not sure, but I remember to see Saint-Lambert as a name in the paper, so he knew, but I don't remember much about it. So, but I remember that there's a link. Yeah.
And I was so close.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone online. I know we're going to wrap up soon, so just stay in tune for the answers to our final 3 questions before we let Dr. Rose get back on the turnpike. Why don't we do 1, 2, 3?
So mine is a comment that Iris has heard before, but just on the theme of the French being sort of whitewashed out of the story, I think it's also important to note that so too were African-American indigenous troops.
Was my question.
Right. Fought on the American side. And in fact, it was French who were the reliable reporters on this, observers, who wrote in their diaries, and in particular, another one by the name of von Closen, who estimated that 1/4 of the Continental Army, as it was marching to Yorktown in 1781, was the word that he used was Negroes, and that was probably Black, indigenous, and mixed. And so that too was an inconvenient part of the story that was left out for 2.5 centuries. And finally, I think, thanks in part to the journals of the French, were able to have primary source material to document that piece. And I just wanted to add.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Very true.
I was going to add to inconvenient parts of the story, the crossing of the Delaware. It's also Black and indigenous.
Yeah,
I made that possible.
Yes, exactly. Oh, but actually, everything. If you start to dig, well, they're everywhere. Let's say it like that. It was everywhere. It's not just at one certain point when one person writes it. If it comes out in few sources, of course, a large part of different regiments at different times. That's why it's so hard to estimate, because the numbers are fluctuating throughout the war. But overall, also even Chastellux himself, he's also commenting on it, that he sees Black soldiers, he sees Native Americans to probably want to join or not, the French and so on. So there is a lot of source material out there, but the key is to put it all together. And the thing is, there's always one sentence in a whole book, so you have to find them and then put them together in order to reconstruct. So it's a long process, and it would be great to start a research group in order to do that all together, because we're all trying on our individual levels, but it's hard because it's scattered. And
Of course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So, but it's true. Every time you really look, you can find stories.
Okay, so following along on that, because the French did note this, but we know that Washington had not been receptive to having an American participate in the army. What comment, if any, did Chastellux or any of the other French make about that contradiction?
I'm not sure specifically about what the French have said about the contradiction. What I know is that, for instance, Chastellux, he is not commenting on that at all about George Washington. I think many people at the time were thinking there's a cause we have to fight for, and we cannot talk about certain topics. You can see that, for instance, in Jefferson wrote to Chastellux as well. The question of slavery is something I want to put forward to the next generation, because it will create disunity, and I cannot deal with that now. These kind of comments are coming up often. What you can read in the French accounts overall is some people are very pro-slavery before leaving, which you can see in their writings, and they just imagine it's a economic system we are all part of. But then they go to different parts of America and observe slavery as how it really was. So you have to imagine, if you're living in a French castle, you never saw the practice of it all. So when they came here and saw plantations, some were very horrified. There's, for instance, that Dumas, he's also traveling through what you would call the Sugar Islands just after the revolution. And he is just appalled by what he sees. It's interesting, in his memoirs, he's writing a lot about this. And he went to a slave market, and he said he had to run away and throw up because it was just so bad. And then he joined what you call les Amis des Noirs in France, which is an abolitionist group. And a few of the French officers do that. Chastellux himself also was vague about it at the beginning in his writings before leaving. Then in America, he starts to see the practices. And again, he makes a distinction which I would say is quite shocking today, but it's about the good treatment and the bad treatment. So he would say some people treat their enslaved people well, such as George Washington. For him, that's what he says about it. Dumas also, by the way, writes that. He says that the slaves, is the quote, that slaves were running to him when they saw him again and kissed his feet. These are testimonies that are not necessarily true. It probably Dumas had imagined that situation. But Chastellux himself, so when he describes certain places, the more he goes south, the better, the worse it becomes for him. And then at the end of his life, he writes a whole book about abolition. So, I mean, it's not a book about it, but it comes through it that he's a proponent of abolition, which is also, by the way, the spirit of its times, because end of the 18th century, more and more people start to think that. But so anyway, it's very diverse. There's also people that don't mention it at all, which is also, this is sort of a weird situation where you can imagine on the road to Yorktown, at one point you will encounter plantations. So, or you, for instance, the French, even in Newport, they have servants, and probably a lot of them were also enslaved or maybe free, but black servants, and they just don't comment. So that shows you something as well. They might not want to talk about it because it's too complicated, or they just really don't care. That's another option. So but again, it's very contradictory, because most of the French are from aristocracy. Some of their families are tied to the slave trade too. Yeah. And then you can be against it, but in practice they're not. And then, it's a very paradoxical often. And sometimes they would write in one letter that they're shocked, and in the other, they're like, oh yeah, it's great because that plantation gives so much money. So it's just, well, as here in America, it's yeah.
I was going to say something that's been said over and over. History is written by the winners. And so it's from the perspective of whomever is doing the writing at that time. Mm-hmm. So that speaks to Dwayne's question, and just says in a different way what you've been saying, that whoever's doing the writing, whoever has the power, they write from their own perspective. And with regard to the United States and our relationship with the French, mm-hmm. a lot of historians base our involvement in Vietnam as a result of the situation that the French had there, and we extended the relationship between the French and the Vietnamese because we supported the French, and they had performed so poorly in World War II.
My last question. I'm gonna give it.
Kind of question comment. What kept coming to mind was the series of Francois-Jean terms, and one of the main French characters that you heard through the whole thing was Lafayette. So it was very refreshing again to hear all of this information. And like it has been said, there's a lot about our French relationship as a nation that was left out. That was good PR because we needed to build our nation. But it's sad because you don't know. And to hear all of this about this man and how important he was, I just want to encourage you in the work that you're doing, because that's very important to make all those connections. Mm-hmm. And again, I don't know who actually wrote Directed Term, but the people who are not mentioned, there's only one black character in the whole series that's even mentioned, and that's in New York. Women, yeah, there was spies because it was about the American spies. Yeah. But as far as the French, I'm just reflecting on the fact in my mind, like the only French character I even remember through the whole series that was mentioned might have just been Lafayette. Yeah. So I'm wondering, this is the whole series.
We have to make a series about him, just about him. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I agree, like,
on the map.
yeah, but it's totally true. Lafayette has taken over, we could say, the entire story of the French. And every time I say, oh, I work on the French and Americans, oh, Lafayette, immediately. That's the reaction. So it's time to recognize that there are more French. Yeah. Thank you.
Just thank you. We look forward to your book and your ongoing research and information. Thank you for bringing us to us in Trenton and lifting us up, right?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
And